if you can give your property over to short-term accommodation, it's an opportunity to make very lucrative income if the house is in the right location. So what we've seen are residential properties that once perhaps housed a family or permanent rental being purchased and given over to short-term accommodation. So that's one less family that lives in that street, and in some cases 40% of what were previously residential streets were given over to short-term accommodation. Whole of house letting has given rise to the party house phenomena, where you get large numbers of people having a holiday in a whole house, and it's called the party house phenomena, where lots of noise late at night and people next door who may be a family who are getting kids ready for school in the morning. It disrupts their amenity and their routine. If you're currently letting out a couple of rooms in your house to visitors, or you've got a whole house or unit that's given over to short-term accommodation, you will have what's called existing use rights, and that use will be able to continue. So if you want to start letting out parts of your house to visitors, that's the home-based business, that will be now self-assessable. It'll be as long as you comply with a series of conditions, and that can happen anywhere in the Shire, any house or unit anywhere in the Shire. That'll be quite easy. But if you want to turn your whole house over to short-term accommodation, that'll be assessed, that you'll have to make a town planning application, and that'll be assessed as consistent and impact accessible in medium density, high density residential zones, as well as the tourist accommodation zones, the rural zone and the rural residential zone. So you're likely to get an approval. But if you want to turn a whole house in a low density residential zone over to short-term accommodation that hasn't already been operating that way, you'll need to make a town planning application that will be assessed as inconsistent and impact accessible, and there's a likelihood that it'll be refused, because we're trying to keep low density residential neighbourhoods principally for permanent residents. Okay, so here we are on Pridgeon Esplanade. It's a medium density residential zone. It's an area where traditionally holiday letting has taken place for decades. And so under the new planning scheme, it's proposed that any new house or unit that wants to be turned over to short-term accommodation, the owner would make an application that would be assessed as consistent and impact accessible, because it's consistent with the sort of practice that's been going on here for decades, holiday letting that's been taking place here for a long time, and is likely to get approved. We're standing in Woodland Drive in Pridgeon Beach, typical of a quiet residential neighbourhood, and under the planning scheme, the new planning scheme, if you're currently operating a whole house short-term accommodation here, that will continue. If you're letting out one or two rooms, that will continue as well. But any property owners who want to turn their house over to new short-term accommodation, a whole house short-term accommodation, they'd have to make a town planning application, which will be assessed as inconsistent, because it's not typical of the type of use we want to see continue in this quiet residential neighbourhoods. It's important to get the balance right, because Noosa has always been a great place to live. It's been a wonderful community as well as a great place to visit. And with the advent of short-term accommodation, it's changed the game, but we want to make sure that it's managed in a way to make sure that short-term accommodation happens in areas where it's meant to happen, and our residential neighbourhoods, which are our community heartlands, are maintained, so that Noosa stays a great place to live as well as a wonderful place to visit.